Friends, it is time to talk about the circulatory system. Yay, I know you're so excited. This is going to be just kind of a brief overview. We're not going to go into as many details as we would if we were in class together because you can't really answer or ask any questions. So you will have 2 days to take a look at this overview, brief overview, and then a quick quiz on Thursday. Let's go. Giddy up. What's up with the circulatory system that we have? We've got basically a couple of tubes going on. We've got our food tube that starts with our mouth and goes all the way through stomach, intestines, and winds up in our anus. And then we've got our breathing tube, our trachea, and into our lungs. And that's where gas exchange happens. Then it goes into our circulatory system, and the nitrogenous waste come out through our urine. So we are kind of two tubes within a body tube, which is kind of interesting to talk about. So why do we have a circulatory system? Why don't we just diffuse all of these things in and out of our cells through that passive process? Let's take a look as to why we do that. Why do we have to have a circulatory system? Well, first of all, we have to exchange lots of things from one side of the cell membrane to another. Number one, we need fuel, and that fuel is mainly for us sugar, glucose. And so that's going to run our cellular respiration, make our ATP for us and help us run. We need nutrients. We need things to build things. We need calcium, we need sodium, we need potassium, we need proteins. We need all these things going from one side of the cell to the other. We need oxygen, obviously, right, to run our cellular respiration. We need to get rid of our nitrogenous waste, and we need to use diffusion to accomplish that process. So what's a greater concentration on one side of the cell membrane is going to diffuse through passive transport to the other side of the membrane. So what are the limits of diffusion? Why aren't we just one big cell walking around? Well, we have too many things to get into our cells, like oxygen and nutrients and energy, sugar, glucose, and we have too much to get out, our nitrogenous waste. We can't just use diffusion to come into and out of the cells themselves. We have to have some kind of a circulatory system, an enclosed system for doing that. And that's going to be our blood vessels. So within that system, we can transport our nutrients, our fuel. We can have our gas exchange. We can get rid of waste. We also have, what's really cool, is our defense system, which is really big right now, right? We're hearing a lot about that. The immunocompromised system, our immune system, is part of our circulatory system. Part of it is within our blood vessels, and part of it we'll talk about today is also included in a secondary tube system, circulatory system, called our lymphatic system. It's a whole completely different set of tubes that we have that works in conjunction with our circulatory system. So what is our blood good for? These beautiful things right here are your red blood cells. They do not have a nucleus. It's the only type of cell in our body that does not have a nucleus. White blood cells, they do have a nucleus. So white blood cells do have DNA in them. Red blood cells, no nucleus and no DNA. Most of your blood is liquid. It's plasma. And that's going to become really important in the coming days, weeks, and months. We're looking for a vaccine for this COVID-19, for our SARS-CoV-2 virus friend. What we're going to look at is taking the antibodies in the plasma of people who have already been exposed to it and have survived it and have developed an immune response to it. We're going to take those antibodies and work on a vaccine. So plasma donation is actually going to become a huge deal in the coming days, weeks, and months. The rest of our blood is solid. We've got red blood cells, we've got white blood cells, we've got clotting factors like platelets and things like that help our blood to clot. The red blood cells themselves are beautiful and nice and smooth, but they don't last too long, just a couple of months, and that's it, right? So what happens to them when they die? They get reconstituted. Their parts are broken down into the spleen and put back into the blood system and used to make new red blood cells in our bone marrow. So our hemoglobin is what makes our red blood cells red. It contains iron as one of the molecules that make it up. Hemoglobin is a protein in the cell membrane, embedded in the cell membrane of the red blood cells. And hemoglobin's sole purpose is to latch onto oxygen, take it to different parts of the body, drop it off, and pick up carbon dioxide and take it to the lungs where it can be expelled as CO2 waste. So, wow, those little red blood cells do a whole lot of work. Also within our circulatory system, running through our veins and arteries, we've got leukocytes. So erythro, remember our word parts that we did in that quiz at the beginning of the year? Erythro means red, leuko means white, cyte means cell. So leukocytes are white blood cells, and they are part of our immune system. We have two basic kinds. There are actually tons more and lots of details about them, but we're going to gloss over that for now. I've shortened this down quite a bit just to kind of give you the overview of what's going on. We've got granular and agranular. Agranular are the ones like the big guys that just roam around, the phagocytes, and they're going around and they're eating or engulfing anything that doesn't belong to the body. So our monocytes and our lymphocytes are going to be the ones that will find the viruses in our body. If we're exposed to a virus, they're going to attack them, they're going to engulf them, and they're going to get rid of them. You have leukemia, that is a cancer of the blood, and in fact, it means that you have too many white blood cells and not enough red blood cells, which is a big problem because the red blood cells are what's carrying all of our gases in exchange. So we can't do without our red blood cells. So what is going on with our circulatory systems? Not all animals have the same kind of circulatory system. Simple organisms like fish have what's called a two-chambered heart. Instead of the four chambers like we have two atria, a left and a right, two ventricles, a left and a right. Fish just have one atrium and one ventricle. And they have that because gas exchange happens for them instead of lungs like what we have. That happens in the gills. And so the extra two chambers of our heart are specifically meant, hi honey.
This is so interesting.
Thank you. Are specifically meant to take care of the gas exchange that in fish is taking place in the capillary beds of their gills. So amphibians are a little bit different. They have what's called a three-chambered heart. So they do have two atria like we do right over here, the left atria and the right atrium, but they have just one ventricle at the bottom. And that's because they don't have the complex lungs like we do. They can also do gas exchange through their skin. And so they don't need that complicated high pressure blood system that we have. We, on the other hand, and other mammals have what's called a four-chambered heart. So we have two atria, a left and a right, two ventricles, a left and a right, and the atria and ventricles on the right-hand side of the body over here are going to be bringing in this blue fluid, and that's not deoxygenated. It's not completely lacking in oxygen, but we call it oxygen poor. And that's why the blood in our veins is darker than the blood in our arteries because it's lost most of its oxygen. Oxygen is what binds to the iron in the hemoglobin and turns it red. So because most of our oxygen has been dumped off in our cells at this point, the blood coming back to the right side of our heart is oxygen poor, and we color it blue for that reason. Then we have to take that blood that comes into the right atrium, pass it to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it goes out to the lungs through the coronary arteries. And it goes to the lungs, it drops off the carbon dioxide, it picks up the oxygen, the blood becomes nice and bright red again. It enters back into the left atrium of the heart, the top chamber there, and then it goes down to the left ventricle, and a high pressure pump on the left-hand side of the heart pumps it out through the aorta and out to the body to be dropped off with all those nice oxygen molecules attached. Whew, that's a whole lot right there. Okay, so we got 2, 3, and 4 chambered hearts going on here. This has a fairly low blood pressure in our fish friends. Why? Because it's a very passive process. They don't have lungs that they have to dump off the oxygen and pick up, or dump off the CO2 and pick up oxygen from. They just have the gills that they need to flow around and over. So fairly low system, or low pressure system there. This one has a little bit of a higher pressure, but not as much oxygen because they're also, these amphibians, these three-chambered heart organisms, are able to do the gas exchange through their skin also. And in us, the very closed high pressure system, we've got high pressure because of the lungs that we've got to filter our blood through, and we have to have the high oxygen in our body. So it helps us to be a little bit more competitive, so to speak. So when we're taking a look at the evolution of this circulatory system right here, what's important to remember is that these organisms over here, what are called ectotherms, that means they don't regulate their body temperature at all. Same with our amphibian friends, same with our reptile friends. They do not regulate their body temperature wherever their surroundings are. That is the temperature of their body. So it's nice and hot outside, and they're very happy, nice and warm, which is why you don't see many reptiles and amphibians out at night because they are cold. They are the temperature of their surroundings. Same with fish. Now, endotherms, which is us, birds and mammals, because we're able to regulate our body temperature, we want ours to remain about the same, about 98, 90, 99 degrees, no matter whether it's 20 degrees outside or 110 degrees outside. In order to do that, we have to have a lot more energy. Actually, endotherms require 10 times the energy that our ectotherm friends do, which is why we need that little bit more sophisticated circulatory system going on there. So let's take a look at what does the heart itself look like, what are the major parts to it, and how does it work. So like I said before, we've got two atria and two ventricles of the mammalian four-chambered heart. Atria receive the blood either from the body, like on the right-hand side, or from the lungs on the left-hand side. And the ventricles are pumping blood out, either on the right-hand side to the lungs or on the left-hand side to the rest of the body. If you'll notice right here, the walls of this left ventricle are a lot thicker. They're more muscular. And if we had been in school, we would have dissected a sheep heart and seen the same thing, where these walls of the ventricle are really thick because there's more muscle involved there. Why? Because the ventricle over here on the right side only has to pump the blood as far as the lungs, and then it comes right back, right? So the heart's there and the lungs are there, and it's really easy. It's nice. But this side of the heart has to pump the blood that's coming from the lungs all the way out to the entire rest of the body, way up to the top of your head, way down to the tips of your toes, way out to the tips of your fingers. So that blood pressure is high. In order to do that, the walls of the ventricle are thicker because there's more of a muscular contraction involved in that part of the heart. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart. So the arteries on this side of the heart, leading from the right ventricle, the arteries are going out, they're away, arteries are away, and the pulmonary arteries are taking this oxygen poor blood to the lungs. Then we've got the aorta. The aorta is the biggest artery in the body, and it's taking blood away from the left-hand side of the heart, where it's received the blood from the lungs, and it's going all the way to the rest of the body. Veins are carrying blood back to the heart. So the biggest vein we have in the body is this one right here. You see it coming into the left-hand side of the heart. It's called this is the inferior vena cava, and this is the superior vena cava. And it is receiving blood from the body to go to the right-hand side of the heart to be pumped out to the lungs. Capillaries are really, really thin blood vessels. So in order to diffuse from one side of the circulatory system to the other, we have to have capillary beds. And they are only about 1 cell thick. You can have lots of good exchange going on there of oxygen and carbon dioxide and other nutrients. Blood vessels in general are either have muscles inside of them. So our arteries have a layer of thick muscle. Why? Because it has to withstand a lot of high blood pressure because it's coming from the left-hand side of the heart, most arteries. Capillaries, again, the very thin 1 cell thick. And then our veins have a very, very small or very thin muscle layer. And they also have these things called valves inside of them. You'll notice that this is a nice rigid tube. The walls of this artery are nice and rigid because it has high blood pressure. You notice that the walls of our veins are kind of floppy almost. Because the pressure is not very high in them at all. They have to have what are called valves inside of them. So the blood coming from our feet and going up our legs back to our heart, it doesn't go back right down into our feet again, right? So we have little things called valves that keep the blood from going back down against gravity or with gravity. They also have a narrow, arteries have a narrow diameter because of that. If you think about trying to suck up a liquid through a tiny little coffee straw, as opposed to um, like a big thick straw, it's harder to suck up the liquid through the little coffee straw because the diameter is a whole lot smaller than in a regular drinking straw, right? Same with our arteries. So they're the narrower the diameter, the higher the pressure is, which is what you need for an artery wall. Veins have that low pressure, and then here's a picture of the valve. So this is your gastrocnemius muscle in your calf, and you have some veins going up through your legs to get back to your heart. And this little flap right here will close after blood flows through, so it keeps it from following gravity to go back down. Now, if you've seen anybody, usually pretty older, they have what are called sometimes varicose veins. What happens there is people who stand on their feet a lot so that they're constantly fighting that pull of gravity in their veins on the back of their legs can sometimes be seen bulging out. And it's because the valve has failed and the blood is pooling in that area. Can you live with varicose veins? Yes, you can. It's just not as efficient and it's sometimes not as attractive either, right? So we've got these valves that are in veins only, they're not in arteries. Capillaries are at the end of the artery chain and the beginning of the vein chain. And so they're in between there. They're only one cell thick. We've got our gas exchange. We're dumping off of our oxygen from our arteries into the cells. We're picking up our CO2 and our wastes to go back to the heart and then also to be drained into the kidneys to get rid of our nitrogenous waste. We've got the passive process of diffusion happening there. We also have the secondary system, which we'll talk about in a second, the lymphatic system. It's also a very passive system. There is no heart to pump fluids through our lymphatic system. And so it's a very passive process. It relies on our muscles to push that fluid through the tubes and vessels. And also movement of the body. Gravity helps to move that fluid along in there. And diffusion is going in and out through the capillaries and then also into the lymphatic system here. That's the arteriole and a venule. That's just a name for a really small artery and a small. So what happens when we're getting rid of things in the cells? Well, we don't want to get rid of all the stuff, right? We want to keep some of that fluid because that fluid has to keep going back. Even though the fluid might leave our arteries and go to the cell to bring the nutrients, to bring the oxygen to the cell, fluid's going to also then come back into the capillaries to go through the vein system and then go back to the heart. We also get fluid that's going through our lymphatic system, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. We go. So you might have known someone in your life who's dealt with breast cancer, and they have different stages of breast cancer. Stage 1 is where the cancerous cells are located right in the breast tissue itself. Stage 2 and stage 3 are where you've got migration of those cancer cells into the surrounding tissue, mainly the lymphatic system. So if you've known someone who's struggled with breast cancer, sometimes they will have to go in, and if the cancer cells have moved from this area to this tissue right here, they're going to remove these lymph nodes. So what does that mean? This whole entire blue system throughout the body right here, it's not the veins and arteries. It's a whole different network of tubes called the lymphatic system. And its main purpose is to transport our white blood cells and partake in our immune system. The lymphatic system is our big main fighter in our immune system. It collects fluid, it cleans it up, it helps regulate the volume of blood in our body, and it helps drain our fluids right into the vena cava, which is going into the right-hand side of the heart, and then it's going to take it to the lungs to get rid of some of those chemicals. So the lymphatic system is actually, you've probably heard of these, your adenoids and your tonsils and your lymph nodes. Like when you have those swollen kind of lumps in your neck when you're sick, it's because your lymphatic system is fighting off an infection. And those nodes are just kind of big clumps of lymphatic tissue where the lymphocytes, the white blood cells, can collect. And if they're fighting off an infection, it's going to get pretty ugly in there. And there's a lot of dead tissue that can collect in those lymph nodes. And then they start to swell and put pressure on the nerves surrounding those lymph nodes, and it can cause pain. Now, in the case of your tonsils, those are in the back of your throat, and they are part of your defense system. Can you live without them? Obviously, because people have their tonsils taken out all the time. Same with adenoids. But the more research that's gone into it, the more doctors have discovered, we probably should try not to take those important lymph nodes out. Those tonsils and adenoids do serve a purpose, if at all possible. Let's keep them in there. Part of our lymphatic system also is our spleen. And can you live without your spleen? Actually, yes, you can. Our body can recycle red blood cells without the spleen. So sometimes you might have heard of someone who was in a car accident. Oh my gosh, their spleen was damaged and they had to remove it. They just have to be a little bit vigilant with getting tests and things like that to make sure their circulatory system can pick up the slack. Our appendix is also part of our lymphatic system. So you see how all these things are connected and they get infected? Well, they get infected because they're part of our immune system. So they're always fighting off bad guys. In our appendix, we only have one. It's a small little sac actually at the end of our large intestine. And sometimes it can get filled with pus, dead white blood cells, and other things that are just not very good. And if it doesn't get moved out of there and dumped into our large intestine to be expelled from the body, and stays in there, it can become infected, it can swell, and it can even burst. And if that material that's in the appendix can get released into the body where it's just floating around, it can cause a lot of damage. So the appendix, the tonsils, the adenoids, the spleen, they're all part of our lymphatic system, the secondary circulatory system that we've got going on. So again, if we were in school, we would be taking a look at all the structures of the heart, so don't try and memorize them at all. This is the right-hand side of the heart. The walls are thinner. Left-hand side of the heart walls are thicker because they have to pump blood from the left ventricle all the way up through the aorta and down to the rest of the body. We would normally take time to know all the names of the valves, separate the atria and the ventricles, and the atria from the different tubes and the ventricles from the different tubes. We just don't have time to do that right now. So just know that all those structures do have names to them, and the valves are preventing the backflow of blood into the different parts of the heart. These little things right here, they're not labeled for you, but they're called chordae tendineae. And these are actually string-shaped things. They're small muscles that attach to the valves, and they're what are called your heartstrings. So your heart does have strings on the inside that pulls your valves open and close. Kind of cool. The coronary arteries are important because they are supplying blood for one function only, and that is to supply blood to the heart. So when you have a heart attack, it's usually 9 times out of 10 because these little tiny arteries right here on the outside of the heart get clogged up with plaque. And when they get blocked up, that means blood, fresh, nice oxygenated blood, cannot get to the parts of the heart. Well, if parts of your heart don't get blood, they die. When parts of your heart die, you have a heart attack. So what can doctors do? Sometimes they just can't open up those arteries. They've been blocked so strongly with plaque and other things from usually an unhealthy diet. They have to take a small little other vessel from another part of the body, and you see how they've taken it and grafted it onto the heart, and they've connected it so that it can bypass. So they call that surgery a bypass surgery, where you're bypassing that blocked section. There's the blocked section of that artery right there. See where it's kind of clogged? We've taken another vessel and we've just bypassed that section, and we've created a whole new pathway for blood to flow to the heart. So when you hear of like a triple bypass and a quadruple bypass, that means they've had to bypass 3 or even 4 of these blocked arteries. That means there's a lot of damage usually to the heart, and the person has to take really good care of themselves after that. I just said that we're not going to worry about the names of the valves of the heart. If you'd like to go and delve into them deeper because you're going to go into medicine, feel free to do that. Go back over this a couple of different times. It'll help you if you take some gross anatomy classes. We've got AV valves and semilunar valves. AV valves go between the atria and the 2 ventricles. Semilunar valves go between the ventricles and either, in this case, the pulmonary arteries or the aorta. You've got 4 valves in your heart, 2 on each side. This is an interesting little video I'm going to show you here in a second. Cardiac cells are really cool, and we talked about that back when we did the different types of tissues in the body. We talked about cardiac tissue being fairly unique. It has those intercalated discs, and those cells talk to each other, and they talk to each other by touching each other. So the signal goes from one cell to the other through those discs. Now, when you have, say, 3 or 4 or 5 different cardiac cells in a petri dish all by themselves, they will beat all on their own. Boop, 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 boop. But as soon as they touch, they start beating at the same speed and in the same tempo, which is really kind of cool. Your heart has a kind of a main control center for controlling that beat, how the cells contract and get smaller and then cause that heart muscle to contract. And that is called your pacemaker. It's your sinoatrial node, and it's in the wall of your right atrium. So over here on the right-hand side of your heart, and it tells the AV node, which is at the bottom left-hand side of your heart. The SA node says contract, so the atria contract. The AV node then receives the electrical impulse and says contract, and so the ventricles contract. So you get the atria, then ventricles. Boom, 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 boom. 2 beats, and they're happening at different times, which is kind of cool. And we also just talked about, when we talked about the brain and the nervous system, that we've got the medulla oblongata in your brainstem. That's going to regulate that also. It controls the pace of your heart. So when your heart speeds up because you're nervous or you're scared or you're running or whatever, that is controlled by your medulla oblongata. And that's what they call, when they say someone is brain dead, it means that maybe their heart is still beating because the medulla oblongata is still working, that brainstem, but then all the rest of your thinking and your processing, all the cells up there would not be functioning. They would not be conducting any electrical impulses. So your medulla is in your brain stem, and that's going to control both your breathing and your heart rate. What happens in one cardiac cycle? Look here. We've got 2 contractions that have to take place. One is systole, and that is where your ventricles are pumping. They're contracting, and they're pumping the blood from the ventricles out to where it needs to go. Then you have a relaxation part of that cardiac cycle, and then you have diastole, and that's when the atria are refilling back with blood. And those 2 types of pressure created by the different contractions of the heart are what cause your blood pressure. You've probably heard of that before, and if we were in class, we would be learning how to measure our own and each other's blood pressure, our systolic and our diastolic. So our systolic pressure is going to be usually higher, right? That's a 120 or a 110 probably for you all, or maybe even a 100 over 80, 70, or 60. So probably a good pressure for you if you're athletic is going to be maybe 90 or 100 over 60 or 70. Blood pressure for me, mine typically runs about 120, 125 over 75, and that's really good. Now, when you start getting blood pressures like 150 over 100, that's when doctors say, hey, you need to do something with your diet. You need to start taking medicine to reduce that blood pressure, because that means the heart is working way too hard. It means it's going to basically wear itself out by doing all that pumping. That is one cardiac cycle. And here we go, measuring the blood pressure. It's really hard to describe using just a video without having you all in front of me and using these blood pressure cuffs. So suffice to say, we have to cut the blood pressure off. We're listening for 2 sounds. We're actually listening for 1 sound and then for the second sound, for that sound to disappear. So the first sound is the amount of pressure that it takes for that blood to start squirting through that pressure. So the higher the pressure that the blood is able to get through, the higher your blood pressure. And then the second sound that we're listening for with the stethoscope in our ears is for that sound to go away. So we'll hear like a thump, thump, thump as the blood is squirting from the pressure of the heart through that artery again that's been blocked off by the cuff. And then when we no longer hear that sound, that is the diastolic blood pressure. And we want both of those to be in a normal range. You can't really take blood pressure on someone more than 3 or 4 times in a row because you can damage these blood vessels by cutting off that blood supply. So there we go. Our high blood pressure is about 150 over 90 or 150 over 100. And that's when doctors want to do something either with diet or with medication. And that, my friends, is your tour through the circulatory cardiovascular system. It was really fast, but you have 2 whole days to digest that and get ready for your quiz. I will see you tomorrow.